UPLS, University of Edinburgh, and also the Royal Institute of Philosophy in London. It's a public outreach grants. So basically, the London gives us money to organize the event to make philosophy accessible to the public. And Norman just published a book, so I thought it would be a great idea to organize this event in Lighthouse Books. This fellowship is actually Barry Maguire and I work together to make this happen, and also we have to have a book to actually organize a book launch. And I'm going to give the stage to Tony Carey to explain what this is going to be.
Sorry.
What is it?
You want to say it's a two-piece again, since you said?
No, yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, so by the way, whatever you say is not going to be on the stream, so we would have to kind of repeat and summarize the questions for the stream view.
So thank you. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. This is certainly a pleasure to be able to have a conversation with Dr. Norman Ajari. And we really do want to thank the Royal Institute of Philosophy of London for making a public-facing event, because there's so few opportunities in the UK, and I think Europe overall, to actually hear from Black philosophers and seriously engage our research. Most of what we say is still taken as polemical, and we're not really giving credit for a kind of positive, forward-looking philosophy that's thinking differently about dehumanization, enslavement, colonialism, etc. It's very difficult to say, not to say too many positive things about Norman. I think Norman's an extraordinary scholar, really. I met him a few years ago when he was just raising ruckus, in the United States. And, when I moved over here, it seemed like a natural thing to try to get someone of his talent and his kind of research capabilities and insight at the University of Edinburgh. I think the institution and certainly the department benefits from his insights philosophically and his kind of research productivity. It would have been a really interesting situation of us 10 years younger when we were in the same department competing for publications. But I'm very comfortable with what I have now. I'm topped out at 100, so I'm chilling. But this young brother's insights and books is fantastic. I do want to say a little bit about, I recently finished, Afro-Decolonial Manifesto, and I think it's fantastic. I think that it's something that's accessible to everyone, and it makes very clear, crisp, distinct arguments, which is something that philosophers are not used to doing at all. And there has to be something said about this, because Norman takes a view that really tries to investigate what are kind of the pillars that Black people are thinking about and the pillars for Black liberation. And what often ends up happening when we talk about philosophy is Black people become compacted into other people's theories and worldviews. So Black people, and I talk to my classes about this all the time, is that we try to teach white people or white Europeans how to interact with Black people that make white people better. Norman is thinking of, well, what is a way of thinking? What are the values? What are the perspectives, like pessimism or communism, or what do we have to understand about liberalism that enables Black people to think clearer about their own position, their lives? And that's something that I think good Africana philosophy is meant to do, right? It's to present arguments that give you a kind of assuredness about your worldview, assuredness about your position, and to clarify the moments that we're really in tension in. And I think we could look across the world now and see the rise of right-wing authoritarianism. We see the moderate position that white supremacy has taken, not only in the UK, but certainly in the United States. And we think that these are aberrations, right? But if you're looking at Norman's work, like his books on dignity, his works on Afro-pessimism and Black male studies, you can see that this is really an outgrowth where he sees the normative vision of Western societies that fails in Western democracy is deeply and insidiously saturated with anti-Blackness. So I guess I'll turn it over to him so you can discuss his book more actively.
Well, thank you very much, Tommy. I'm really humbled with your wonderful words, and yeah, I'm really glad to be here tonight, especially since with you guys, since I guess you felt the inspiration you provided me with throughout the pages, some of the pages of this book. So I will just say a few words about maybe the genesis of the book. It's a very strange, it's a very strange project in a way, since the book has been published in French first, like for a year, even more than a year. The first version of the book was published in Sub-Saharan Africa, especially in Togo. So it's interesting to know that the French novelist and publisher Leonora Miano is the originator of the project of the book. So she asked me, she literally came up to me with the title of the book, say, you should write this very specific book. At first it was a little strange to me, but I think it's a good idea, right? Because it's a manifesto, and I think a manifesto should always be a collective product, right? Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto was, of course, the byproduct of an urge and a demand from the Communist Party. Same with the Surrealist Manifesto. It's a byproduct of a collective intention. So I believe it's interesting to, if you want to write a manifesto, well, then you shouldn't write it. It has to be something that comes from outside and something that is the byproduct of a collective decision, of a collective will. And this sort of editorial endeavor, because the book was sponsored or published first by an Indian publishing house to a sub-Saharan African audience, then to a French and Francophone audience, because there's then a French published version, and then a English version published. I think this is an interesting way of talking about blackness, especially since I knew that all along throughout the process. So usually when you write a book, especially when you write a book about race, you try to have a specific place in mind. Books written, especially in France, about race are filled with French examples, right? And it's annoying sometimes. I started writing this book while I was still teaching at Villanova University in Philadelphia in the US, so you will find some American examples in the book, but I finished it here in Edinburgh, so we'll find some parts about the UK, and of course I'm French, so you will find some aspects about France, and I know something about Sub-Saharan Africa, so I really tried, and I hope I managed to do that, to live up to this Pan-African experience of blackness, you know, building upon my experience in different places and different experiences of blackness, to try to fight against the idea that, you know, black people here and there have nothing in common, just to try to show that, yes, of course, culturally there are some similarities, but of course we're not all the same, but what is the same everywhere is anti-blackness. What is the same everywhere is negrophobia and anti-black racism, and that is something that creates, you know, the aspects and the cliches, the caricatures of black people created by anti-black racism are very, very similar everywhere in the world. They are not specific to British culture or French culture or American culture. They're just a byproduct of colonialism, and colonialism is, modern colonialism is Western in essence, and they talked about it, like they exchanged things, right? We have here two scholars that originate from the state of Louisiana, so they know many things about how French and British were on the same page when it comes to black people, right? I don't think people in Louisiana are like, oh, the French were way better than the British. That's a very weird idea. No, and yeah, since I have like similar experiences, I know that, you know, these sort of transnational, internationalist view of blackness and anti-blackness, sort of, that was my hidden goal in a way, writing this book, is try to infuse it with all those observations from many places, but it's a, you know, it's meant to be a very accessible book, so I just try to infuse the book with those observations without making it too obvious, but it's part of a method, if you will, right? The method that's not, the method of not trying to adopt the point of view of a sort of abstract universalism, but rather a juxtaposition of observations. But yeah, basically just to give back the mic to my friends. The book is in 3 parts, not because I'm much of a Hegelian, well, because I kind of am. But I remember the parts I wrote the book. But the first I swear I did. The first part is really about the notion of anti-blackness and what I call the diagram of anti-blackness. I try to create a sort of funny visual presentation of a funny that's silly to say that this way, but let's say a visually appealing and easily identifiable way of representing anti-blackness that I believe is student-friendly, just in order to map out some aspects of anti-blackness that are very widely discussed throughout popular discourse, like from terrible things like genocide to more funny aspects of our experience, such as cultural appropriation, which is of course way less damaging than genocide. But just, to provide my readership with a hint and a sort of the most robust explanation I come up with those popular parlance and the history of the main grievances Black intellectual history has against those different aspects of white supremacy. And then the second part is a critique of usual modes of addressing the question of anti-blackness, and namely what I call a sort of liberal way of addressing the question of anti-blackness, that is a set of discourses and political practices and agendas that tend to minimize the importance and tend to silence the fact that the core of the Black political tradition is the Black radical tradition, that is a tradition of a mix of socialist economic politics and Black autonomous, the idea of Black autonomy, either about the African continent or the Americas, right, or the Caribbean, the independence of the Caribbeans. All those ideas are today considered to be extremist, to be fringe, but I believe and I think reading the history, the political history of these ideas, talking to militants, talking to people who took part in America, in the Caribbean, in Europe, like trying to discuss with those militants, with those activists. This is really the core, the crux of our political tradition, and I try to revive this to show its contemporary relevance, and that's really the aim of the last part, which is a discussion of this specific tradition beyond the traps of East liberal recuperation, trying to update, try to provide you with the patch notes of Pan-Africanism and radical Black and African socialism and communism. So yeah, basically that's the outline of the book and where it comes from.
So I'm going to give the stage to Michael. Can you introduce yourself to the Edinburgh crowd and maybe a little bit of commentary on Norman's work from your perspective?
So I am Michael Thomas. I'm visiting here in Edinburgh from the University of Amsterdam. I teach in the philosophy department and do some teaching in media studies there. It's a pleasure to be here. I think for the first reason that Tommy already mentioned, which is to have the experience of being no longer in Europe, but at least in the UK and Scotland, on a panel with two other black philosophers, which is not something that I've had the experience of. There are gatherings in the US, but there are gatherings and there are meetings and panels and there are organizations, but in my academic experience, they kind of, I'm glad you said that because I thought I was just slacking. Thank you. You're gonna make me loosen up. All right. And I think it's also really important because, as we're saying, this is to get to Norman's book and why I appreciate having to have the opportunity to have the conversation. Being someone who turns late in their career, not late, but at least I wait until I make my way sort of through the system to say, okay, now I have the time to actually do work in Africana because I feel like I have the psychological space. I think both Tommy's work and Norman's book, especially right now, are comforting in the sense that you understand how the theory does help give both voice to an experience and understanding that there's a way that when you teach black philosophy or when you teach about anti-blackness or you teach about racism in the university, it comes out in a very conceptual framework where you don't understand that there's not only an experience behind those concepts, but you're talking about psychological, sociological, and material effects that are actually in play with the people who might be teaching you or your fellow students in the classroom. And then from that level, there's all the folks there who aren't even invited into the university. So there's a lot of work to do with Norman's book on thinking about the role of even doing black philosophy in the university as a black philosopher and understanding what your commitments are, not only to the students in the classroom, but that you do sit in contact with a tradition to which you have an obligation, which if once you hit that point, it really does kind of change, I think, in important ways, the way that you relate to your work. Like my work slows down at that point because I realize there are things I have to interrogate before the papers come out and the books come out, because that's not what academic production is normally there to allow you to do. So I think the only other thing I would add, I think, of the importance of the book is in the way, on both of those levels, it does become, I think, a confirmation that as somebody who's working from this other level of development in Africana philosophy, so not having had the experience of working with organizations and activists outside of a university, you start to see that those kernels that you're finding as you do the research are the tradition that's coming from outside. So like when Cedric Robinson talks about the black radical tradition and all of those people who were there as kind of, they're the ones who were writing, but the actual tradition was what was happening outside in those movements. You can start to feel that it's like, okay, so I'm in the right direction. So the next step then is, this is where what I can now understand or what I work through theoretically actually connects me back to the people. And you can sort of force that. I think that's a really important function of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a great point because it's true that is something that was forgotten very quickly with the institutionalization of black philosophy, especially in the US. They forgot that it was really a byproduct of something that came from the outside, that is to say, radical activism. And not to say that, black philosophers are just basically activists, but that without the activism of the civil society, without movements, such as Black Power movement, and even, the civil rights movement, especially in its more like muscular form, so to speak, and the Panthers and all those things, and the Black Students movement, all those movements gathering together, even like the Black Arts movement, all those things, like the convergence of all those things, we wouldn't have black philosophy in American universities, right? And some black philosophers, of course, in America, such as Tommy and others, I think kept this sort of torch alive, but some others were quick, to cut their own roots and replant their own tree in a white orchard, just to say, well, now we are part of another tradition. We're part of a tradition of another discursive game that is about the great tradition, for instance, of American philosophy, or the great tradition of analytic philosophy, or even the great tradition of continental philosophy, right? Just to forget, like, that's the whole idea of philosophy born of struggle, this specific philosophical organization that I think you even led at some point. So the idea of a philosophy born of struggle is really that, right? That, of course, as academic philosopher, we have a specific position, right? We are not directly linked to an organization. We do not have to work as ideologues for a specific cause, but still I think we have a responsibility for people, especially this responsibility is specifically interesting because we have this position, because we have this comfort, right? Because we act as vampires, you know, like taking money from the white institutions, saying like, okay, now I can think about black stuff with white money. That's interesting, and so we can be critical of our own, you know, of our own people in a way. Things that an organizer, like 100% organizer, cannot do. So of course it can be annoying to some people at some point. But still, I think it's an interesting position and a position we should be grateful for, like, because, of course, that's not something we created. That's something that the people created, black people created for us, and so I think we can serve them this way. I think this book is an attempt at serving them. And also, yes, at criticizing people who believe that just jeopardizing this whole tradition and lecturing black people about their own life is something that is actual philosophy, or just demonizing working class black people is something that's worth the name of philosophy. You see what I mean? So that all those things. So yes, in a way, yes, it comes from a place of gratitude, and especially in this very context, right? The U.S. in this way is specific because of the intensity of its black activism. That's what secured the large position of black philosophy in American university that I think is unique in the Western world. There is no equivalent. As I often recall, there is 2 black women professor like philosophy in France, 0 black men. So that's not much. And there are many of us, you know. France still has those islands in the Caribbean that didn't give it away, like those are British. It's like, no, that's just a joke. You did good, not like keep colonizing those places. That was ironic. But yeah, we're still suffering from this situation because of the sort of timidity of our activism. We didn't secure the same thing in America did, and that's why it backfires today. And that, like, the Trump administration basically trying to destroy black studies along with many other minority discourse within the university, because they realized the threat it poses. Even if, you know, many sections of, you know, the black academia try to accommodate everything, but they try to accommodate the wrong party. They should have accommodated the Republicans instead of the Democrats, I guess. But that's another story.
You know, one of the things that I think we really have to appreciate is the effect that this book has in the UK, right? Because many of the philosophy classes that are still taught throughout Europe look at race and black people as an object of study, so to speak. So it's one of the reasons that I think things like epistemic injustice are so popular within the UK and within Europe, because it's trying to create a virtue ethic, so to speak, of how you engage with these other people. And the reflection of that is, well, be a better white person, your virtues, right? It's a mechanism of subservience where if you listen to the right black person, or the black person you deem as the right black person that fits with your politics, you become a better white liberal. And that's been the way. I've been here for 5 years, almost 5 years, right? 6 years. I'm sorry, honey. That's why you bring your wife with you. You know, being here that time is giving me a lot of time to patiently observe how black people are being taught and thought about, right? And I think one of the strengths that of Norman's work and this book in particular is that it shows you what it means to actually be a specialist and an expertise in Africana philosophy. And that's something that the UK doesn't really appreciate. The view is, oh, we can talk about race. Everybody has an opinion about race. Everybody has an opinion about gender and inequality. But what does it mean to be a specialist, to understand the intellectual archive of a group of people for 200 or 300 years? What does it mean to be a specialist that specifically studies what dehumanization, inequality categories, all this stuff, right, does? Right? What does it mean to like found a school that they're very luckily we know that Norman's a part of in Black Male Studies? Right? These are innovations that we would expect for any other group of thinkers that were capable and deemed themselves philosophers, but we still think of it as exceptional when black people do, right? So I would really like to hear more about how you conceptualize the manifesto as a grounding and a contribution to Africana philosophy from the perspective of something that practically every black Africana philosopher should read, should be knowledgeable of, could be conversant with.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. That's an important part, because I do not try with this book to reinvent anything grand. You know, it's really the idea is really to be part of a tradition and try to honor a tradition, because this tradition has not been acknowledged enough, right? I think that's because when it comes to black ideas and theories, we really resort to some cliches and some very anti-intellectual ideas, right? You were talking about being part of a tradition. That's something that usually we deny to black theories and ideas, right? We consider them to be deprived of any tradition. For instance, it's very rare that in philosophy we read books by black abolitionists, right? Black people who wrote things about slavery, because we consider those texts as mere documents about the past. We think that, oh, he's just a guy writing about their experiences. But if you read Ikiano, if you read people like Kuguano, who were people that were part of the Enlightenment, right? The late Enlightenment. They wrote at the same time as Kant was writing his critiques, right? Immanuel Kant. You read very sound arguments against slavery wrote, right? Historically, we know that by the black people themselves, not by white people who were masquerading as black people, as it usually happened during this period of time. So we know that we have former enslaved people who lately, like throughout their life, learned how to write and read and compose profound arguments about anti-black racism, slavery, and even like religion and many different things. But we do not consider them part of a tradition. It's very bizarre, because if you read like other authors, like for instance Tocqueville, right? Tocqueville, who wrote about democracy in America, you do not just apprehend those texts as a mere document of life in America in the 19th century, right? A sort of historiographic document. Say, no, it's a foundational work of political liberalism. It's a foundational work about the tradition of thinking philosophically about democracy. But usually you do not provide black people with the same honor of being the first of theorizing something. No, it was just a little book about slavery, and then slavery went abolished, so it's irrelevant. Like, it disappears into irrelevance as long as slavery was abolished. But was anti-blackness abolished at the same time? I don't think so. I think many of the structures that were described by Equiano and Cuguano are still vivid the century after and then the century after, but we do not integrate those ideas in our corpus as part of a relevant tradition of Black radical thought. So this is this effort I wanted to do with this, I wanted to make with this book, right? To try to recuperate those authors that have been documentalized as just sources for historians. Say, no, there is actual philosophical and political intuitions in like these decades and centuries of Black thought that should nourish and intensify our theories about Black plight, identifying the evils of domination and Black dehumanization, and also find strategies and intellectual theories and concepts to try to identify all those things.
Building off of that, because you made a comment when you were doing the introduction to the book, where you said that you give life into concepts that might be kind of silly, like cultural appropriation. And I was like, I don't know, man, because it's heavier in the book. And I think the reason it's heavier in the book, and I think this is important, is if we're talking about kind of how...
That's comparing to genocide. That's what I say. It's not like, okay, genocide, cultural appropriation. I just wanted to be disrespectful. That's what it's over.
No, I understand. But I think it raises a bigger point, though, about what we're thinking in terms of Black philosophy or Africana philosophy, what it does for our concepts, right? Because that's funnier because, too, when we think about cultural appropriation, it's who performs whose art, who gets credit for art in this way. But the way that you present it in the book has to do with the history of both the appropriation of Black knowledge and the destruction of its sources, which is what you're talking about when it comes to this tradition. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit more then, either about cultural appropriation and specifically, or the way that you think taking this Afro-decolonial approach to sort of do some transformative work on the way that we approach these different topics.
Yeah, with this specific question of cultural appropriation, I think it may be relevant because I think it illustrates sort of my method in the book, right? Which is materialist, if you will, even if I am not a huge fan of this word, especially these days, but focusing about power struggles, right, and power imbalances instead of morally charged attacks. So, and it is a defense of cultural appropriation, because usually a defense of cultural appropriation, using the notion of cultural appropriation and acknowledging it exists. Because usually people coming from where I come from, that is this materialistic or inspired by socialism and communism, right, approaches tend to dismiss cultural appropriation as irrelevant as a concept, and I do not believe that. But I think first, if you want to identify cultural appropriation and when it operates, you have to identify a victim of the appropriation. You have to identify something that is deprived from something by the act of appropriating something. For instance, someone, a white person wearing locks, right, wearing dreadlocks. I mean, I think maybe in bad taste, right? It's sometimes not very, very cool, not very good looking, but it's not appropriation to me, just because no one is deprived of anything because of that. It can be hurtful to people looking at it because it's ugly, but I do not believe it's like, no. I haven't checked because I didn't want it to be biased. I just wanted to make my point. No, and I said maybe. It's not even my personal taste. I know people who, I know white people who wear dreadlocks. It's true that they're not very good looking, but I mean, I love them dearly. I love them dearly. So it doesn't affect them as people. They're not bad people because of that. That's what I meant. They're just ugly. Sorry. No. What I wanted to say is that when you actually have cultural appropriation, you have a victim, so to speak, right? The most famous example that I found, that it's not in the book because I found it afterwards when I familiarized myself with the culture of this beautiful country. You know about the restaurant Nando's, right? That was founded by this South African guy and I think a Portuguese guy were in somewhere in maybe in Angola or some place like that, eating good chicken, and say like, oh, sell me your chicken recipe and your spot for $1,000, right? And sign me this contract. And then the woman who was making the chicken signed the contract, and then because they have the funds, they expanded the branch because, you know, and use the formula and then become billionaires with that. That is cultural appropriation, right? When you profit off someone, steal their knowledge and use them, when you use capitalism to make profit out of folk knowledge, right? That's cultural appropriation. When you turn what people call, what economists call a non-rival good into a rival good. A non-rival good is a good that is absolutely shareable, right? Like knowledge. We teachers are just selling you non-rival good. That is, when I am teaching you something, I duplicate my knowledge, right? I do not lose my knowledge when I'm teaching you something. When I send you a PDF, I'm not losing my book. Rival goods are the other way around. When I give you a book that I possess, one of those books, for instance, well, of course I lose it. That's a rival good. So I think cultural appropriation works turning something that is non-rival, something that is infinitely duplicable, such like recipes, into something that's rival when you put a copyright on it and deprive people from the benefits of its economic exploitation. So that's what I wanted to point out, right? I think this notion of cultural appropriation is really, really useful, but paradoxically, the more I see it used in the public sphere, the most it becomes hurtful to the people who are actually suffering from cultural appropriation, because we tell them, well, no, sorry, it doesn't exist. Like, sorry, you just like, you who have been like deprived from your creation is just like this black guy with dreadlocks who want everyone to shake their head if they see white people with dreadlocks. No, it's not the same thing. One is just a matter of taste, and the other is just a matter of theft. And I just wanted to make this debate a little clearer.
Maybe I'm going to connect to the audience. So if we could also, if you have any questions right now, we could actually direct your questions to the speakers. Just to give you some time to think about questions, I want to talk about a little bit of anecdotes. I did a little bit of research and checked the Communist Manifesto sold 500 million copies since its publication. So like, we're gonna start this 500 million copies from today, and the Lighthouse Books is going to be the sole proprietor, maybe turning a little bit of like a rival goods out of that. But it's so I have a question from maybe from that perspective. Manifesto has to be something like we can concretely use to improve our living condition for the. So you talk about ideology and this strategy to actually make things happen. But as a readers of this book, what can we do to actually live up to this sort of standard that you presented in this book? What can we do with this book after distributing millions of copies?
Well, with this book, of course, the part I struggled the most with was the last part, because I'm not good at giving orders. That's always something, and I'm not really into anarchism. I'm more of a communism guy. but you know, the idea of not receiving order and not giving them is always something that was an idea for me. I think it's Bakunin who said that. But I went against my own nature to write this, but instead of really providing people with directives, you know, that's how you should do. I think I used my experience in organizational leftist and anti-racist spheres to create more of not a guideline, but maybe an idea of how to organize, right? How to organize in terms of the pitfalls that Pan-African organizing can entail, right? For instance, my idea was that if we are not able to collaborate within different Pan-African organization, an anti-racist organization, and socialist organizations, and all those things, then we cannot even envision a unified Africa and unified Black people, right? Because often we are more afraid of our diversity than we're afraid of unity, you know? And this is something that I often observed in my interactions with people. So I think this may seem a little naive or even a little abstract, but I really believe that it speaks to some of the issues I encountered throughout my political journey, in a way, right? This is really a difficult time for organizing. this is really a situation when, for instance, in France, we were seeing like organizations that are literally outlawed by the government week after week after week. And this book was written at the very beginning of this very specific and very intense moment of counter-revolution that is now igniting the US, starting in the UK with white supremacists trying to burn mosques and things of that sort. It is very hard in this situation to write a guideline to fight back against fascism. But so I just wanted to point to some pitfalls or some troubles to avoid, because my point was not to give people goals, but rather to guide them towards the very process of their organizing, right? So this is what you should do to create a Pan-African project. It's more like here are what the people like Malcolm X, people like Kwame Nkrumah, people like Huey Newton, this is how they struggle within their organizing with, you know, the injunctions or the sort of infiltration of white racism within, or the issues the government may raise, and here what you be mindful of. So that's more of what I try to do, because I think this is really a moving target, right? You cannot say here is here is the goal, here is the final goal. Of course, we have a final goal that is Pan-Africanism and so on and so forth, but we cannot just say, here are the actual step in the world to reach this goal. This would be outdated in 6 months. But I think if you want to be relevant throughout time, self-criticism is absolutely primordial. So in a way, this is really like, of course it is a book that critiques white races and all that, but I think it is also a book that critiques black radicalism of what names itself black radicalism from the inside, and yes, maybe that's the main thing about the strategy here.
Okay, so we'd like to open that to the audience. Does anybody have any questions or comments or questions?
I guess my question is, it's kind of a popular topic, especially recently. Taking theory, do you think for racialized groups of people was assimilation, especially coming from that liberal perspective, assimilation ultimately a good thing for racialized groups of people? No.
So the question was assimilation a good thing for racialized groups of people? Tommy Curry answered no. For the people on the internet. So do you want to elaborate, Tommy?
I mean, I could elaborate. You know, there's so much to say. So if we look at the effects of assimilation, or in the United States what became known as integration, we see cultural supremacy of certain types of values over others. So Harold Cruse in the 1970s wrote this great essay about Anglo-Saxon values and the need for a particular black culturalism. And what he argued was that when you're trying to incorporate people within, say, a white republic or white nation, the values you're assimilating into, like liberty, equality, tolerance, etc., are the same values that were used to justify your extermination. So what the problem of reconciling this is that, for example, we're at the University of Edinburgh, that was really ground zero for the development of ethnology in the Anglo-speaking world. We're supposed to respect the Enlightenment as we're all participating in some form of philosophy, and somehow we're supposed to just forget, it so happens, right, that all the white people like Hume, Dougal Stewart, Anna Ferguson, etc., had real investments and got their chairs in moral philosophy and natural history on the back of saying that black men specifically, but black people as a whole, were savage, immoral, etc., etc., etc. So when you're moving into the society, who dictates the basis of what you define yourself as? And in the UK, you see this emphasis on tolerance and a disowning of historical legacies of discrimination, anti-blackness. And even contemporary society, you see the disowning and denial of anti-black discrimination and racism as a whole. So if you're in a society that's run by a dominant group of whites that speaks in their history, their language, their philosophy, their sociology, and say that somehow that's equality, you're subjugating the existential reality of oppressed racial minorities so that you can say you have a peaceful and tolerant society. And this is reproduced in various forms. In the United States, it's segregation, right? In Africa, it was apartheid, right? These repressive regimes that then become dissolved still maintain the supremacy of white people in those geographies. And they say, well, look, now that we're not killing you, now that we're not enslaving you, now that we're not brutalizing you every day, and we do through in institutions, or underrepresent your knowledge in universities, or in various aspects of the economy or governance, you're free. So the racialized minority becomes part of the society by accepting that a different degree of violence or a different quality of violence rules their life, but they're still subjugated. And what white philosophers do in the UK is they want you to concede progress. So in every conversation I've had in the last 6 years, the conversation is like, but isn't things better, right? Isn't it better here, where there's one black professor of philosophy in the whole country, right? And people can tell you about what you should think, they've read none of the books that you've read. right? Isn't it better just to say, hey, we're trying. There's one black guy in the philosophy part, but we're trying, right? We're diversified. There's you. You see that underrepresentation, that subjugation, right? Are we really believing 500 years that I'm the only black person that could have got a job here, right? Like there's institutional practices, there are cultural practices, right? That are involved with that, and we're asked to accept ourselves always as exceptions, right? So assimilation doesn't work. You're assimilating into something, right? And a more important part, it doesn't give you equal weight in terms of your status as a person. Because in trying to become an individual, severing your group, your history, in being the token or the exception, as if you're the only one qualified and other people who didn't make it, or even saying, well, I participate, but I accept being ruled by those who don't look like me or share my interests, then your only answer to that is, I have to dissolve myself to this basic element of humanity, right? Where everyone else who takes classes here can hear about, Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Hume, etc., and say, oh, they look like me, they're like me, they're Scottish like me. And the black person's like, well, I have to identify with them, right? That's a different process. And that ultimately is in a nutshell what happens in liberalism. The reason you have so many black people, black philosophers that identify as liberal and progressive, feminist or not, any other kind of accumulation of things, is because we're trying to assimilate into their ways of thinking. Our history doesn't comport that, but we're told that we have to because that's what gets us jobs. So it's a very real phenomenon where we're rewarded not for our insights and intellect, our genius, right? But we're rewarded for how closely what we say aligns to the worldview of the dominant white majority. And that's the danger.
Is Amsterdam better than what's your experience in Europe, continental Europe?
So I say, speaking of assimilation, you're watching my reaction, right? And I think it's hard for me to answer the question for a couple reasons. One of which is, after my previous teaching experiences, once I moved to this environment and knowing what I don't know about the place where I'm teaching, I gave a couple presentations and I went home to then figure out what's going on before I even go outside and start talking again. And I think that might be the kind of grounding of my answer. I think in the way that we've talked about the divisions there are other black professors and black PhDs who are doing work in black and Africana studies there. Well, we have to kind of go and find each other because everybody's sort of separated in pockets, and that's something that I haven't done. And I think at least within philosophy, there's an environment for doing decolonial philosophy and engaging with different forms of black thought. So there's an openness, and I'm still figuring out how far it feels like I can go in conversation to something that feels like the kind of home conversation. So I would say I'm hopeful, but like that's my character. Like legit, like that's my character. That's always my approach. It's like the way that I navigate these institutions, knowing what I know, is to always find the people who provide the openings. So that my responses are always based around that. So I think that there are openings and there are places where you can build and talk, and then from there I can figure out how to actually grade the environment. Can I ask Norman a question off the back of that? Okay. Because I think one of the important pieces when you were talking about organization at the end too, right, is you push the process I'm describing is a process that comes from a liberal model in which your success within the institution, even if you're working with other folks, is about individual benefit and work and conversation along the values that the institution has already established, right? So when you come in and you try to do something that would be Africana related, Black studies related, we run into this problem of sort of how to then relate across those projects. And you have this concept in the book of federation and pluralism. I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of what those words mean and sort of organizing either within universities or other kinds of institutions.
Yeah, so, okay. This is a great question. Do I start talking about assimilation in the French context? No, maybe not. You already know what it's all about, right? That's just French assimilation. I think French invented assimilation actually. So this is just a trick so that everyone in the room knows that you're black and you ignore that you're black. That's the idea. Like the assimilated guy is the guy that he believes in equal foot with everyone, but everyone is racist towards him, but he has to ignore the racism he or she go through. So that's the French model of assimilation. That's why negritude, the movement that started in the 1920s, 1930s, was directed specifically against French assimilation. That's really the idea, right? So 1 century ago, French black people started railing against French assimilation because they immediately felt how of a colonial trick it was. But yeah, this question of federation, basically, it was a model that I came up with because I identify, and I'm really proud to say that in the French context, it actually worked out, like it materialized in reality. So I identified the fact that we had many different political Pan-African or black organizations that existed that were not really, like the Trotskyist organization who hated each other, but just separated. And I felt like, because we always have this idea that, we should build a huge organization, like devouring all those little entities to create a massive organization to be stronger. And I do not believe it is a model apt to face the struggles of the 21st century. So I said, what we actually need is a federation. That is, to have all those separated people talk to each other, try to create emulation, and just try to identify the sameness of their goals and the differences in terms of the way they operate, and to just share their tactics, even share their people, and just try to create something greater, but while keeping the agility of those small structures. And it actually functioned. There were many in Paris and in Dakar, some reunions and gatherings of those organizations, and the dynamics is taking form, and I think it's really interesting. So really, the idea is try to focus on what we have in common without sacrificing, our differences and the fact that we have common interests, and that is not only an interesting mode of action. This is really, I think, what I hope to be an interesting political model going forward for instance, a united Africa, united continental Africa, or united Caribbean, or this capacity of working this way as a political translation as well, not only an activistic one.
Any questions? So my question is, any kind of philosophy we all basically focus on, maybe European is called X, and then African is Y, and then Asian philosophy is Z. And then my question is, in the goal of African philosophy is to see how similar the X, Y, Z is, or we just don't talk about it, we just do Y, or we just do Z.
I just answer very quickly. Yeah. So our philosophies, such as Western philosophy, Africana philosophy, and Asian philosophy, for instance, are all them in a corner is the goal to find a common denominator between them, or just to insist on their specificity. Am I translating correctly here? So I think all those traditions, if they are really traditions, like, I think they all have maybe specific emphasis on some core questions, and I believe even their differences, like for instance, if you take philosophers that are so vastly different from one another, such as Tommy Curry, Lewis Gordon, and Charles Mills, they all start from the question of the human definition of humanity. The fact that the idea that the definition of humanity is not something that is as obvious as it is in white philosophy. Do you think I'm correct?
Yeah,
I think like the title of the book is The Man Not. You see what I mean? I mean, I'm not saying you're all the same. I'm saying like that's the question of being black in America, in the Caribbean, or in Europe. That's the question. That's what raises the question. Even if you read black philosophers from Africa, such as I don't remember. Never mind. Even Ashul Bembe, like that's the same kind of question. So I'm not saying all those people agree, but I'm saying that's the main question, right? The question is talking philosophically from a point of view where you own humanity, reason, and intellect is not assured, is not recognized. So I think from this point of view, Africana philosophy addresses a question that is transversal to all those other discourses, but that all those other discourses would not acknowledge as foundational, right? They would say that, to put that, like for instance, I think the main question in Western philosophy, either continental or analytic, is the question of knowledge, right? They start from knowledge. But who knows? So in a way, I believe that the question of Africana philosophy is more radical and foundational than the question of white philosophy, just because it is more material and grounded in historical reality, the historical reality of being denied, like in the flesh, the capacity of thinking. And so where does the thinking come from? Like, is the monkey that I am supposed to be thinking right now, right? Is the subhuman that I'm supposed to be thinking right now? I have to address the question of my own subhumanity first before raising the question of knowledge, language, all those things.
I think that's right. No, it's you know, Charles would agree with you.
I think even Lewis.
Yeah, who knows what Lewis would say? Yeah, good old Lewis. But I'm not going to turn it into that, even though I should. Yeah, so I mean, Cartesius sums, this is exactly what Charles Mills says black philosopher was where it starts with, right? You know, when I teach my students Africana philosophy, like I like intellectual history, so we start with really old texts. And enslaved African people talked about knowledge as being the dismissal of ignorance. And for them, ignorance was the belief that you should be a slave. So the question that black philosophy asks is always a meta-ethical commentary on the presuppositions of black philosophy. And it's strange because, you know, in the United States, I was in a pluralist department. We had analytic and continentals. Here, it's mostly analytic. And despite the ways that, you know, like I come from a program where you had to know the history of Western philosophy. So you had to know Plato, Aristotle, you had to know the moderns, right? It's a you know, you're trained differently in the States in some parts. But what's funny about it is that when I end up talking to analytic philosophers, they don't know the history of Western philosophy, right? So they give commentaries about what they think philosophy is that has no basis whatsoever in how philosophy actually developed through like the modern era to the you know, kind of linguistic turn, etc. They know their area. That's perfectly fine, but what it does is it removes them from the kind of contextual basis of how the Western metaphysical tradition develops. And then when you come in with the Africana tradition, right, and you say, okay, well listen, here's key distinctions around issues, the only way Western philosophers see that is as a manifestation of politics. So if I say, for instance, right, like in taking black male studies, well, black men are patriarchs, black men have been victims of patriarchy. They can't understand that because within their analytic or philosophical anthropology, they only see otherization through the feminine or through sexual minoritization. Well, but that's not how history developed, because here, right, when you started studying races, you started studying men. You said these men weren't human beings and were the par excellence subject of inferiority. You see, that historical context matters because it tells you where your ideas were situated versus what you say today. And there's a huge gap in that. So when you look at Western philosophy, and I was actually just debating this on a panel, when you look at Western philosophy, like Jacques Derrida, for instance, says in an essay on white mythology, that Western reason or Western metaphysics is just the idiom of whites universalized. It's a mythology. So then if we accept that there are mythological or narratological function of how philosophy operates, then what do we say about the fictive? So white people created a view where they're the only ones that had reason. They created a view that they're the only ones that were human beings. And everybody else was pushed to the margin. What exactly am I debating about them? You see, the problem is the position of saying, yes, we acknowledge that Western philosophy created mythologies that limited the possibility of other people being seen as human beings, but somehow there's a kernel of truth in the lies that it made. And Africana philosophy is something that's grounding a comparative notion of the human and all that it entails. The question of ignorance and false belief, the question of what one could know, the question of how one relates to other communities as the basis of not reproducing the false anthropology that you're going to get in common with other people. So to me, the union is a question is more about the inquiry and the overline between Africana philosophy and the rest of the world. Right? This is what Du Bois was working on, kind of pan-colorism as part of his pan-Africanism. He wanted to understand, how is it that the East thinks? How is it that the indigenous thinks? What is it about people who are pushed outside the European metropole, so to speak, allows us to originate knowledge in a way that compares our experiences and material conditions? The West has not traditionally been interested in that. And what ends up happening with decolonialism is we're looking for this comparative basis of, oh, well, maybe we could reclaim. But I'm trying to have conversations about decoloniality with people that refuse to even read black people. You know, and this is the limitation, right? That you expect the black philosopher to come in, it's like, oh, well, they're just going to make a polemic, right? They're just going to say that this stuff's bad. But it's you know, my wife and I always joke, it's almost like we're teaching race 101 here, because the conversation is based on white people having a preconceptualization of what Africana philosophy is, or black male studies is, right? Without reading any of the material, because they can't respect black thinkers as actual authors and philosophers, and then coming back and giving you their view of it. So they read one paper or heard one talk, now they want to debate you on what they think the politics are. Philosophy can't operate in that way, right? And that's why my personal view is Western philosophy is not really an issue, because so much of it's been disproven. So much of it is still being called into question, that the real issue is building positive knowledge-based programs through empiricism, our science, our history, right? That's trying to give value and substance to these other issues like Y and Z, rather than trying to put it in conversation with the illusions that we get from the Western tradition.
I think you hit the point. I think if there's anything left to kind of build on, it's, I think what happens in the turn towards Africana is, and this is a kind of a combination of what's been said, right? A repositioning of where the inquiry starts with the thinker, right? I think that's been like one of the biggest shifts that I find when I teach is, like, if you take the concept, like, if I teach James Baldwin, and we talk about James Baldwin's sense of reality, right? Where sort of the way that you perceive the world, the way that you understand, and not just think about, but feel what is true and not true, depends on sort of where you sit within a particular social formation, right? So we'll talk about the ways in which Baldwin is then asking people to address themselves to be able to understand other folks and what they should be doing. And within the philosophy classroom, if we're trained in history of philosophy, we'll start to turn to theories of phenomenology and theories of intersubjectivity. And that's not to say that I don't think Baldwin is doing something that is actually working on a phenomenological register, right? But the concepts will always fold back into that language. If the concept folds back into that language, you end up in this position of saying, so what Baldwin's asking us to do then is something that we've already heard, which is that I have to understand the other before I understand myself. Right. And I think something that, it took me actually the last time I lectured, I wasn't being fast, I didn't catch this. right? But if you think about then, what's the presupposition behind that framing of intersubjectivity? It's the person who is doing the thinking is already sovereign over the situation, right? And they're the ones who get to decide who outside is even a thinking being or not a thinking being. And when you jump back to Baldwin's investigation is actually, I'm saying, if what I'm describing about the structure of reality is true, and if what I'm describing about whiteness and white innocence is true, then there is a structure in place that prevents you from actually seeing yourself as human or as vulnerable as other folks. And that's the presupposition of your thought. So it's actually a self-interrogation first, prior to you actually figuring out whether the world is real. And it's not about whether or not your thoughts are true or false, but whether or not you're right about what you are as a being versus the myth that you've been told about who you are. Right, and I think that's a different question that does, I think, a lot more fundamental existential work without you having to sort of work it through certain configurations of reason that ultimately, I think in a lot of ways we can use to obfuscate ourselves rather than actually address a problem. I think that really becomes another reason to sort of think about this as a kind of way of changing the structure of the questions rather than sort of looking for the kernels. Yeah.
If I can just add one point, I think that's correct, because one of the things that I find here especially, and it's some of the is racist, but the white liberals don't understand how insidiously racist it is that when I talk about race in Scotland or London, inevitably they will say, oh well, the UK context is different. So they will tell you that if you're importing Fanon or Newton, etc., it doesn't apply here. Now, I want you to think about this seriously. But they have no problem teaching political liberalism and Rawls here, which presupposes a constitutional democracy, and they don't have a constitution. You see, the idea is, I mean, this is an important point to me. The idea is that even when there's an empirical reality that severs a white constitutional democracy like the United States from the UK, or Scotland specifically, there's no problem saying this still applies. The suppositions are different. All of Rawls' theory of liberalism is based in the idea that a constitution gives grounded ideas that can overwhelm comprehensive doctrines. But nonetheless, they say it still operates, even though they don't have that here. But you take a black person, someone that's arguing about histories of colonialism, histories of oppression, and they'll say, well, you didn't have a civil rights movement here, King doesn't apply, Newton doesn't apply, Fanon doesn't apply. You see, they think our thought's provincial, when their thought doesn't even apply. So it tells you about who gets to talk in terms of a universal approach or universal history, right? Back in the day, they used to call this system or systematic philosophy, like in the turn of the 20th century. But they don't see black people as thinking in terms of a systematic program of philosophy that isolates to polemics. So it makes it almost impossible then to have a true comparative philosophy, because everything that the West sees, that white analytic philosophers see, is, oh, well, it's a polemic and commentary about what we already take as true. They get to situate themselves as true. Every other perspective is just either trying to be a part of their magnificent truth or a criticism. And that's not going to be a functional account of how we could do theory. That's why Baldwin, that's why King, that's why Newton, that's why Fanon, right? They fall to the wayside in these departments. Because you'll get one person, oh, that's what they do some kind of decolonial stuff. And then you'll have a whole group of white people saying, oh, well, their stuff's crazy, it's wrong, it's da-da-da. Right? Those are the backside conversations, right? So then how do you grow philosophy? How is philosophy inclusive when the polite thing is, oh, we'll listen to the paper, but at the end of it, we don't believe anything these black people or brown people say, right? We have to start being honest about how the discipline functions. And then you ask yourself, well, why is it that people who are really participating and not even innovating in the tradition get to determine the relative worth of others, right? To me, that's a disciplinary question.
May I ask a question, a very, very naive question? Maybe, who are the black British philosophers, radical or not, like in the history? Because, like
historically?
Yeah, even historically, because like, is there a British Fanon or Césaire or all the black radical American tradition? Because it would be even weirder to say like, oh, do not export like Fanon or Newton or Du Bois, and realizing that there is no equivalent. So we are guaranteed that we are not studying any black person at all. Because, like, yeah, in literature there are plenty, but in terms of theory, and especially in terms of theory criticizing the empire, like.
You have, historically, other guys like Africana. I mean, historically, you have people like Africanus Horton. You know, you had Douglas here. You had James McCoon Smith. Right? These people were America, like James McCoon Smith and Douglas, of course, born in America, came here, got PhDs, and they started that kind of, you know, late Enlightenment tradition. And the black, yeah, exactly, Cuyano, etc. Because they're writing in London, they're publishing in London, and this was part of the, like, we had a debate, I guess 5 years ago now. I'm losing track. So like 5 years ago, where the white historian guy, Tom Devine, was arguing that like these people didn't know, and I was like, well, you have all these black people literally writing these narratives that are being translated and published in London, and you're still claiming this innocence of Hume. Oh, if he just knew about black people, he wouldn't have been racist. And even the David Hume Society now, I've been speaking to them quite a bit. You know, the Hume Society saying, well, that's not true, because they actually can see where Hume lived in relationship to, like, you know, Cuyano and these other people that were staying in Edinburgh. And they're like, he had to see them. They were doing, you know, Ignatius' portrait. So it's like, you had to be able to see that, because you had to sit to it. So I think that there is a tradition in Scotland specifically, right, as well as in the South, of black people as an exchange. Like the UK was kind of a hub where people traversed the Atlantic, right, on both sides, right? Because you even had Ida B. Wells here as well. So they have that radical tradition, but nobody wants to lay claim to it. And I think that's, I mean, I think it's crazy, for example, that you had like James McCoon Smith, Frederick Douglass, Africana Horton, who got degrees from here or had some institutional relationship here. Like actually, E. Franklin Frazier actually got an honorary degree from here, right? So you have radical black thinkers that literally walk the streets of Edinburgh that nobody teaches, you know, and then you have to understand from the position, but we're interested in decolonization. That's why I constantly say that Edinburgh is sometimes interested in decolonizing with absolutely no black people, right? They want white liberals to do the work, and then like, oh, you know, and this is a real problem. This is a real problem, right? And the intellectual heritage that I think Norman's a great example of, and this is how I can tell that I'm getting old, because I'm like, oh, everybody else is so great, right? I just don't have, you know, but what Norman's a great example of is this kind of recalling, right? People, you have to understand that there are six black philosophers in the whole country. 6. There are three sisters and there are 3 black men. Me, you, and Lincoln, right? That's it out of the whole country. So when you hear, right, black philosophy, or you read the texts of black philosophers in the UK, you have to understand how rare that is. And then of that subset, think about how rare it is just to have those groups of people actually studying black people. Because the presumption, I think, among white liberals is that every black person studies Africana. That's not true, right? So it's really, yeah, I know. We know those people, but it's a problem, and the impact of it is it really solidifies the Eurocentrism of what we're talking about, right? The reality situation is that Ajari's book, his work, his employment at the University of Edinburgh will be something that people know long after we're dead. Because someone will ask the question, who were the black philosophers at Edinburgh? Who were the black people that challenged this in the 21st century, right? Very rarely will you have people in real time that are experiencing what a historical legacy will be. And because I always think about it as being dead and what people say afterwards, right? You have to really kind of comprehend that moment. This is not just a debate about opinion. What's being produced here is a text at the University of Edinburgh that is making arguments about what's necessary for black liberation in a place where in the English-speaking world, they said black people were irrational, immoral, and should be subjugated, right? That's a very important time. And it's something that I think we have to keep in mind. And if our philosophy department ever comes around, it's something that they would actually start trying to memorialize and react to instead of trying to reproduce, right?
No, just that. No, you can close. Yeah, you can close. Yeah, you can close. We'll talk about it.
I don't know. I could tell that we could go all night with this group, but it's been absolutely amazing to actually have 3 black philosophers from around Europe. Yeah. So just to formally close this meeting, please just give it up.